the land and all. So he went to Haida Gwaii. Because that was the center of a lot of heavy, huge trees. They were logging for years and years. And it's a great description of that industry over throughout history. But there was one tree on the island. It was golden. It wasn't green like everything, all the other trees. It was the golden spruce. And it was a sacred kind of tree for the Haida. And he went there and he had to work his way inland to get it. And he cut it down. And then he disappeared. He had a kayak, all of his stuff was found on the coast. He was in a kayak to Alaska, never seen again. People never knew if he was still alive somewhere. But it's a really good book about Haida Gwaii. You guys should take shifts here, take turns sitting here. Good trip to Montreal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Really hot. It's harder than here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, cleaner as well.
Cleaner there?
Cleaner there in Montreal, yeah.
Is that right? Wonder why, it's a bigger city. They actually have industry there, we don't.
Who got sunburned? It was so bad. Well, it's so good.
You're taking notes.
Yes, I am.
I know these are three, but I don't think there's eight years.
But I'm thinking mine in things, so you might not understand. I know.
All right, I got 2 lectures left. That are going to bring you up to the present. Today, I want to walk you through the other half of the land claims negotiations. Just a reminder, and this is the structure if you're ever recounting this whole story, the IGR story or the Inuit story. Just keep this structure in mind and just remember 2 or 3 points under each of these. You know, the first thing we did was we looked at where the government was coming from before they got to you guys, what that whole history was like, what their orientation was, where their headspace was at, and what kind of treaties they negotiated or more or less imposed on people more often than not. So that settlers, whites and Europeans could get access to the resources they wanted. You know, the Royal Proclamation 1763, it said 3 things. It said that the people who are already on the land have rights to that land under British law. And next thing it said was settlers can't go on those lands and use them for their own purposes without first getting an agreement from the people on them. A good principle. And the third thing it said was only government can make those deals, which they call treaties. People couldn't individually buy lands from some Indian or something like that. It had to be through the government, lift the control so it was consistent, and the whole purpose of the treaties were to basically legally get people out of the way, so they couldn't interfere with what whites wanted to do with the land and the resources. And that they did that with First Nations by creating reserves which were out of the way on lousy land often, and so the good land would be available, especially out in the prairies. So that's where the government was coming from when you guys showed up on the political scene in the early 1970s. You were new at it, they weren't. They had that long history that had lived to them for a couple of 100 years. So that was their jumping off point, was ever talking to you folks about things to do with your rights. And then with the discovery of oil, and suddenly there was it looked like it was going to be an invasion into the north of industrial society. Not just government administrators managing people in their local locations, but industry was moving up, oil and gas industry, obviously, and doing things with the land and promising to do even bigger things with the land. And all the exploration stuff was was intense enough, but it all sort of was leading to the expectation that there would be permanent activity, pipelines going here, there. And all of which could have affected the land in negative ways. They weren't thinking about those negative ways in their planning, and they weren't thinking about the effect of damaging the land and the wildlife that would have on people in the north either. They were just, we got the resources up there, we can see them, we're gonna get them. During that time, that was when ITC was formed. Tagak did his work, his groundwork, pulling people together, creating an organization, hoping to push back against all that activity that was happening, being approved by the federal government without any thought towards you guys. So they set up a little office in town, just a handful of people. Mary Simon was one of them, and in her day, all young, and they just threw themselves into the task of, we got to do something. We got to do something here because they're going to run us right over. So it was getting the government to listen. In those years, the government didn't feel it had any obligation to listen to you guys. It could sort of meet with you, pat you on the head, maybe say yes, 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 but they had no obligation to do anything you were asking. And they knew it. Hey, morning. So those are those early years of the Inuit movement getting started and trying to get the government's attention. Meet with any politician, any bureaucrat they could. Go to the public and try and introduce themselves to the public. Become known and look for support. The next phase was that stalemate, those stalemate years. That began in '73 when that Supreme Court ruling by the Niska in British Columbia turned everything around from the government's point of view. Because the court said people today in our modern time who've never signed a treaty still do have something called Aboriginal rights to their land. Well, what does that mean? They didn't say. It just meant you had something in your hand that the government never thought you had. So the government had to deal with you. It came out 6 months later and saying, we got to deal with you. We have to talk, we have to sort this out. You've got some rights, we don't know what they are, you don't know what they are under law. But we can't leave it unknown because industry isn't going to invest billions of dollars if somebody's lying out there on the tundra ready to go to court and challenge everything and stop and bring it all to a halt someday. So it has the rules, the law has to be really clear. So, and the government didn't want to go back to a court and ask the judges to say more because they found out in the Niska case they couldn't count on the court agreeing with them. So they said, let's negotiate. That way you have some control over what comes out the other end. It means trade-offs for sure, but so, you know, when ITC tabled its first proposal in 1975, early 1976, pardon me, they withdrew it shortly after because there was new leadership with the land claims organization with ITC. John Mbolic had been hired, and he, among other people, felt, oh, we're rushing too much with our proposal. It was written by their lawyer who lived in Toronto. So they pulled it back, went to the communities, consulted with people, what do you want? And they came back with not a big lengthy proposal, full of technicalities, just a set of principles. And one of them was, we want our own territory with our own government where we are in charge. That's it. That was the number one goal. That's when they really started pushing the concept of a Nunavut territory. Well, that was in 1976. Government wasn't having anything to do with that idea. It was out of bounds. They weren't willing to entertain that thought at all. So there was a stalemate. Nothing happened. So we've done that. Then the last class I did with you, walk through what the negotiation process. And you're in 1980, your side was the one that figured out a way to get negotiations going on anything. And the way they did it in two ways. There were 2 points in their strategy. One had to do with owning the land. The whole purpose of the government's land claims policy in 1973, and still today, is its goal was for the government to end up owning all the land, except for little bits here and there, just like they had done with First Nations. That was their model, their image of what a land claim settlement would look like in the end. They would own the land because in their minds, if you own it, you get to have all the say over what happens on it. They just wanted the power to make all the decisions about development and by themselves.
Is that why they created the reserve?
In the past, oh yeah, totally. Absolutely, totally. Park people out of the way so they're not interfering with what whites wanting to do.
Then why can't we buy land in Nunavut? Is it just
There is private land in Nunavut. Yeah, there's not much, but it's I know the Hudson Bay Company has I believe it has title to its original lands where they had their buildings. It's there's not much of it though. And I'm not sure on the latest if things have evolved, because in the hamlets own the land. And but I think people get a license to build on for their houses and stuff like that.
Land lease, around my house, I had to have a land lease.
Okay, so the hamlet still owns the land. Okay. There's just a smattering of leftover ones where like resorts and stuff like that, especially in the West, that were well established. And I believe they had ownership of their land, but not very much, just little ribs and grabs. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, on reserves, people don't own their land either individually, because the government didn't want it to be saleable, so people couldn't sell off the reserve lands. Anyway, negotiating the land claim. So one of the issues was about ownership of the land. And what your side came up with as a strategy to get around the roadblock was to say to the government, okay, we're willing to let you own most of the land when this deal is done. We're willing to go there. You can imagine how the government felt hearing that. Yes, they've caved in. But they said, we'll only agree to that if you agree that we will both share the decision-making about anything that happens on that land. They would get an equal say and control over it without owning it. Government thinks owning means 100% control. Your negotiator said, we'll give you ownership, but we'll only give you 50% of the control that goes with ownership, right? We'll split it. That was the government didn't have a capacity to even respond to that at first. They tabled that in 1981 with wildlife. And it took about 6 years for all the government departments in Ottawa that were involved in anything to do with the environment come around and say, okay, I'll do that. But some held out. Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Wildlife Service, they were hard nuts to crack. They had clear responsibilities for certain things. They didn't want to share it. So just introducing that whole concept of joint management. And your side made the calculation that having an equal say in managing the lands could be just as useful as trying to own it. That fight was not going to get won. So that's one of the things they did. That opened the door. And the other thing they did was they said to the government, because the government did not want to talk about Nunavut at land claims. Just didn't want to go there. So your side said, okay, we agree not to talk about it at land claims. We'll take it off the table. We won't bug you about creating a Nunavut territory in the land claims negotiation. But we do want to talk about creating a Nunavut territory somewhere else at the same time. And so this is what we're going to look at today. they made these strategic decisions in Igloolik in 1979. Big meeting, just to decide how to break the logjam in these negotiations. Nothing was happening. And why? Because, and here's the other main thing that was decided. The reason why nothing was happening was because each side, you guys and the government side, put on the table first the thing you weren't willing to negotiate. Because your side was still waving around that proposal to create a Nunavut territory. Government wasn't interested in talking about that, refused to talk about it. Government side, right from the get-go, in its new policy in 1973, said, we're not negotiating anything unless at the beginning, you agree you're going to extinguish your Aboriginal rights to that land and give them to us. And your side said, we ain't going there. So neither side could, there was nothing to negotiate if people weren't willing to negotiate on those key issues, right? So what your negotiators did out of that 1979 meeting was to say to the government, okay, look, how about this? We agree that we disagree on these main issues. But let's put them over on the shelf for now. And let's see what we can talk about that we can come to an agreement on. And then when we're finished on that, we'll have to deal with those issues then. And we'll see how those issues look to us at the other end of the whole process. Instead of standing in our path at the front end, let's figure out what we can talk about and come to an agreement with relating to land claims. And then we'll get back to this. So that's what they did. That opened the door. Okay, well, let's start talking about stuff. And that's when they agreed to have two tracks. One for land claims, separate from negotiations about Nunavut, happening separately from that, from the land claims deal. So we've looked at the land claims process. And this structure here is a good reminder, a good framework for you if you're describing what's in your land claims agreement. Just putting it into groups of stuff, categories of topics. You know, they dealt with IPGs, institutions of public government, creating them, getting the government to buy into the concept of sharing decision making. And one of the things about those, whether it's the Planning Commission, the NERB, Water Board, unlike other land claims like the Inuvialuit, they got involved in those kind of issues too, land use planning, etc. But they were only on bodies to advise the government. Here's what we'd like the government to do. Your side wasn't willing to accept that low level of involvement. They said, we want to create bodies that have the authority to make the decisions. And we'll settle for 50% of the number of people on those boards, 3 each or whatever. But they had a strategy up their sleeve on that. Because if they could get the government to agree, okay, take the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board. I think there's 4 people on each side of the table. 4 Inuit on one side, 4 government on the other side. Right? And then they would choose somebody neutral, a last person to be the chair, who didn't belong to either side. But your side, because they were committed in their own minds, we're going to have a Nunavut territory at the end of the day here, even though the government didn't want to think of that. But they knew in their own mind, after this is all settled and there's a territory, a Nunavut government, because on the government side, there were federal government people and territorial government people. Back then, they were all still the Northwest Territory. But your side could see ahead to the day when there's going to be 4 Inuit on one side and at least 1 or 2 Inuit on the other side, representing the Nunavut government. No, 2 for the federal.